Hi, my name's Ed Nolan and I'm an A-level psychology teacher, and in today's video we're going to evaluate the approaches in psychology by looking at a unique point for each approach. So in my videos over the last few weeks we've been looking at different arguments and relating the approaches to them, identifying whether it is a strength or a limitation to the approaches. Well, in today's video it's going to be slightly different, because what we're going to do is we're going to look at a different evaluation point for each of the approaches, apart from one, and we'll come to that in a minute. Just like to remind you that when you are using these points to evaluate an approach, whether it's in an essay or in a small answer, it's good to structure it using the P with a C structure. Meaning, you make a point, and that point identifies whether it's a strength or a limitation. That you example that point by using something within the approach or a piece of research. Then you explain why it is a strength or a limitation. And then sometimes for the higher end answers, particularly in an essay, you might want to counter-evaluate. You might want to say, well, if I've said that that point makes it a strength, it could also be a limitation. Now, hopefully you'll see that as we go through our unique points in today's video. But also, one thing I'd like to point out is if you look at this, we have a D, an N, an S, an A, a U and an R that start each of these points. Well, that almost says dinosaur, doesn't it? And that's a good way to remember if you're in the exam, like, what are my evaluation points? Well, think dinosaur, except there's a couple of letters missing. So it ends up saying dinosaur, which sounds almost like the French for dinosaur. So just remember your dinosaur. Yeah, allô, allô. Anyway, should we get on? The behaviourist approach. Okay, what's our point? The point is the behaviourist approach is relevant more to animals than humans. Well, why are we saying this? Well, why are we saying this? We've got the dinosaur, but let's go back to our point we're making here. We're saying this because Ivan Pavlov did his research, and he did it on dogs. This whole groundbreaking research looking at association that led to classical conditioning based on research on dogs in a lab. If we look at B.F. Skinner, who talks about the idea of operant conditioning, well, his research is based on rats and other animals in a lab pressing buttons in order to get food or to avoid an electric shock. But this is all done because it's a controlled environment, but they have done this on animals. But we take what we have learned on animals and apply it to humans. So for instance, if we want to help someone with a phobia, we could use systematic desensitization, gradually introducing someone to a feared object by getting them to associate it with relaxation, all based off dogs in a lab. Or if we look at education, we might use reward charts, merit point systems, operant conditioning. You know, if you do a behaviour we want you to repeat, we give you a sticker so you do that, just the same way that a rat gets a food pellet when it presses a button. Well, the question is, can we apply that to humans? Well, some would argue that humans are not as driven by instinct as animals, and that we use higher order thinking. And that actually what we do is we will rationalise that morals play more of a part in what we do, that emotions will play more of a part in what we do, that social circumstances will play more of a part in what we do. And this doesn't apply to animals. So it is difficult to extrapolate, that means to generalise, to extrapolate from animals to humans. So therefore it's too simplistic, and it lacks the validity because it doesn't account for the complexity of human behaviour. However, what you could say is there is some research on humans though, isn't there? Little Albert Bandura. So maybe it's not quite as clear-cut as we think. Okay, the biological approach. Here we have my mate Adrian Rain down there holding his brain, a biological approach. Now, we know it's deterministic for all its strengths and limitations. We know that it just focuses on nature and ignores nurture, which is a bit close-sighted. We know that it is scientific, and that's a great thing. It has applications which are very broad through drugs and other applications, and that it is reductionist with its weaknesses and its strengths. So actually we have more than enough evaluation points here. So we're not going to add another one for the biological approach, unless I sneak one in quick by just saying that the biological approach is now becoming one of the most dominant explanations in psychology because of its scientific approach and people's trust in biology. Right, cognitive approach. Now, this is a problem that it is too mechanistic. What are we talking about mechanistic? Mechanistic means machine-like. It's too like a machine. If we think about one of the main assumptions of computer analogy, this idea that we are like computers, that we have input, process and output, and that we work in a very logical, systematic way, just like a machine. Well, maybe humans don't. Maybe not all of the time. Maybe we're not as efficient as machines. Maybe we're not as accurate as machines. Maybe we're not as reliable as machines. And that even some of the most controlled individuals will behave in an unusual way. Maybe emotions will play a part in that. So by looking at machines or analogies of machines or computer analogy is maybe not looking at the whole range of the way humans think and behave, and so therefore it lacks that validity. Remember that word again, validity, the actual truthness of explaining all of human behaviour. But you could say though, by looking at this systematic way, we've developed things like CBT, which have been highly effective and really have saved some people's lives. Okay, now, in the life of Brian, they said, what have the Romans done for us? Well, you might say, what might the psychodynamic approach done for us? The psychodynamic approach always gets a good kick in, doesn't it? You know, it's deterministic, it's reductionist, it's not very scientific. Well, let's give it a strength, and its strength is that it has led to the development of talking therapies. So if you think about in the 1890s onwards, these guys here started to say, we think we can explain physical illness, somatic illness, by looking at the way people feel and think about the mind. And so they started to talk to people about what was in their mind. And by doing that, alleviating some of their illnesses and helping them. Now, this has come into something called psychoanalysis, the analysis of the mind. Very much a psychodynamic approach therapy. Now, what this has done, though, is it has developed onto other talking therapies. So, if we look at the one main talking therapist, CBT, person-centered counselling, their roots are all based in the psychodynamic approach, from that first people starting to talk to their clients about what was going on in their lives. And so they can account their different methods to them initially. So what this tells us is that the psychodynamic approach must have had something. They must be doing something right in order for all of this development of very successful therapies and ways of treating people. However, we could say is that CBT is much more used than psychoanalysis, and for some seems much more successful. In fact, some psychologists would say for things like schizophrenia, the psychoanalysis will actually make you worse rather than better. So this tells us that the actual talking centered part came from psychoanalysis, but the mechanics of what they do is very different and seem to be more effective. So although psychodynamic led to talking therapies, it's not seen to be as valid to use as a talking therapist by some psychologists. Not by all. Okay, the positive approach. Okay, here we have Martin Seligman came along and said, we have something new. We are going to look at traditional psychology and push that aside, and we're going to bring on something new. We're going to bring on a type of psychology that is positive, that looks at the positive aspects of human life, to look at things like happiness and what we can provide for others. This is a new paradigm within psychology. However, some would look at that and say, is it really, or are they just redressing old ideas? So for instance, down here is a picture of Confucius. Confucius was a philosopher and a politician in China in the 5th century BC, 500 BC. That's a long time ago. And he came up with the idea of flow, workflow. Does that sound familiar? That actually that is something that could lead to somebody's happiness. So if we look at this idea that we lead a meaningful life and that can contribute, this has already been around in psychology. If you look further down, we've got Abraham Maslow here. He's what's called a humanistic psychologist, and they came around from the USA in the 1950s and 60s, and they talked about things like self-actualization and leading meaningful lives. In fact, you may have heard of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, this idea of how we get to self-actualization. So these principles are very similar to what we have in positive psychology. So some would argue that positive psychology isn't new, that it already existed. It's just a new brand name for what we already had. However, positive psychologists would say no, there is a distinct difference in what we do. And part of the distinct difference is the research that we use to support our ideas. So what have we learned in today's video? We have learned that if we are evaluating, remember, point, evidence, explain, and then if you can, put a bit of a counter-evaluation point in there. We have learned that most of the approaches have a unique point that you can use in evaluating, such as behaviorism is limited because it's only relevant to explaining animals rather than humans. The cognitive explanation is limited because it's too mechanistic, doesn't cover the complexities of human thinking. That the psychodynamic approach has something to offer because it offered us talking therapies, and that the positive approach has nothing new, and that actually it's just redressed already existing ideas within psychology. Well, thank you very much. You've made it through another video. Well done. Can I just say, if you found these videos useful, just give us a thumbs up when you finish watching the video. Take care.